Ladies, gentlemen, and exiles of all ages, it's been a week and a half since the launch of Early Access for Path of Exile 2, and within this time I've been blasting away at my Invoker. I'm currently level 77 and climbing relatively a good chunk into the endgame, mostly just being walled by a serious lack of waystone drop luck. But by my actual setup, my build is just feeling extremely good. Survivability is keeping up just fine. I'm pretty much one-shotting every enemy I come across except for bosses, which do take a couple of hits, but even then they are dying faster now than they were in my comparative setup that I was using for tier 1 maps at the start of endgame, and all due to some changes that only made sense to make once I reached a certain progression point. So today let's talk about all of my changes to my cold and lightning invoker monk setup, where I'm at right now, and how to match my personal progress, what skills, passive points, and gear I have to do what I am doing, with the light disclaimer that this isn't necessarily supposed to be like the undeniably highest DPS build in the game, so much as the one that I have found the most success with myself and the enjoyment that I've had so far, and I wanted to share it with you all. First up then, our main addition since we last talked about what I was using is replacing Stormwave as our strong range skill into now being Falling Thunder. Falling Thunder is extremely strong. It has ridiculous range potential on the lines of lightning that fire out from it, and they fire out in a large cone too. So anything that isn't like a corridor as a zone, this thing will send out sprawling lines of death that just obliterate everything that they touch. We have a bunch of cold damage bonuses from gear as well, and so these lines of lightning also freeze your enemies, like very quickly and quite easily, freezing them before the one shot from the damage totally applies. With high range, high damage, and high freeze application, this then opens us up to using cast on freeze, because even after the trigger skill nerfs, it's still a very good thing if you can apply this en masse and with a powerful skill fueling it, to the point that we trigger this once per pack essentially, or once per Falling Thunder cast if it's aimed well. Then we hit our first pressure point of the build, which is that casting Falling Thunder effectively requires you to have at least one power charge, as the version of the skill without a power charge is just weak and piddly in comparison. So we take advantage of our cold damage and freezing capabilities by putting Profane Ritual into our cast on freeze, the witch skill that marks a corpse, consumes it 2 seconds later, and then plops out a power charge for it to use afterwards. With the first person I saw using this combo being Ted's Bra, the reason that we swapped to this from the earlier game build using Combat Frenzy with the Resonance passive to generate power charges is because that is limited by time. Specifically, while the frequency that you can generate charges with that combo gets lower as you raise the skill's gem, it is still more than 5 seconds between charge generation no matter how you flip it, which is just way too infrequent to actually properly fuel Falling Thunder. So we swap up to Profane Ritual. Now, as you may imagine, this only works when there are corpses around you, of course. It still will be absolutely fine for anything maps related, even bosses on maps, you'll still have what you need when you walk into them, which is a slight bit of planning. But for bosses outside of maps, for things where it is a single target fight the whole time and there's no corpses, I recommend swapping this out for Siphoning Strike as a skill, so you can shock the boss, siphon the shock off of the boss, and then gain a power charge from that. Use that power charge on charged staff for the significant lightning damage boost, and then for bosses you just tear them to shreds with the old classic Tempest Flurry, Tempest Bell, close range combo. All that said, your main question might be, how do we generate our first power charge then on a map if the main way that we continually generate them is by using Falling Thunder? And the answer is pretty simply whacking enemies safely. Hit enemies somewhat slowly and carefully with Tempest Flurry until you get your first cast on freeze, Profane Ritual off. Once you have your first power charge, you can activate Charge Staff, which increases your freeze potential significantly and gives you range to do so safely. And then as you generate more charges, you basically just alternate them between Falling Thunder for damage or Charge Staff to keep the buff duration active so that it doesn't drop off. All that said, let's dive into how to actually put this build together for yourself for anyone interested, starting with the skill and support gems, the auras that we have running, the ascendancy and passive points that we've got going too, and then of course our gear as well. Starting with our skills and support gems, our main big boy skill today is Falling Thunder. This is a large area spreading, high damage, charge consuming melee projectile mixed attack, and so that influences our support gem choices. Perpetual Charge gives us a chance to not remove charges when we use this skill, which is also what you get from adding quality to this skill gem, so it's a really solid choice for the setup to do that with. Long Shot as a support gem increases the damage of the skill when done more than 3.5 meters away from the player, up to a maximum bonus at 7 meters, and most enemies will just be at that range minimum if you use this with power charges because of the incredible range. Then Ricochet as a support gem to make the projectile part of the skill have a chance to chain off of terrain when it collides with it. This helps make up for the potential weaknesses of the skill within enclosed spaces as part of what makes makes it great is its ridiculous cone and outward range, but this support gem makes it highly functional even in things like a corridor, because you can now bounce off of the wall with your actual procs from this, and this will cause even more damage. If I had more support gem slots here, which is my next potential major upgrade, I would add in Rising Tempest for growing elemental damage on the attack itself, and then either Lightning Mastery for a bonus skill level, or Overcharge, which increases the magnitude of shock applied from the skill to increase the damage that we get from that. But that would be a little bit overkill until we hit higher tier maps than what I'm currently at. After that, we have our main single target burst damage skill, which is Tempest Flurry. What this does is just attack extremely quickly, and this has pretty much two main uses, either blasting into Tempest Bell for closer range, high burst damage, or just as a vessel for applying charged staff projectiles due to the attack speed of this move. Either way, the support gems in here match our general goals. Martial Tempo for a significant attack speed increase with this skill, Close Combat for a boost to close range damage with this skill as well, which of course makes sense as it is a very melee range skill and we'll be using it within the range of this the whole time, and then Cold Infusion. This is mostly for helping us get that first freeze on a map, as this makes it easier to build with just basic Tempest Flurry slaps, and realistically for boss damage the main actual output will come from the bell itself and the charged staff projectiles, so the lightning damage loss on Tempest Flurry itself isn't even really impactful. As for additional support gems, if I were to have more sockets here, I would put in Super Critical to increase crit damage at the cost of some crit chance, and Inspiration for mana cost regen at higher levels, as the mana cost to attack speed ratio has the potential to get very out of hand at max skill level later on, especially with the attack speed we're stacking. Past that we have Tempest Bell, mostly just as a combo piece. If you build up to 4 combo by hitting enemies with Tempest Flurry, stick down the bell, and then you can just sort of repeat this on loop. On our bell, we have Rage as a support gem, which generates 3 rage per hit from the bell. This has an internal cooldown, but you can still generate stacks quite quickly, and for us, rage stacks just give us an increase to our attack speed. But increased attack speed is exactly what we are after if you put the bell down and start flurrying into it. Then we have Lightning Infusion to boost the damage of the reverberations, specifically echoing the lightning damage that we put into the bell from charged staff and from Tempest Flurry. And then the fun one for this is Overabundance. This reduces the duration of the bell to 3 seconds down from 6, which is a bit short, but lets you have 2 of them out at the same time. What this lets you do is either A, build combo while the bell is already out so you can completely remove the downtime between them against bosses, or B, if you build combo fast enough, you can actually get 2 Tempest Bells down at the exact same time, and the burst damage that can cause from hitting both bells at the same time is actually sort of ridiculous when it lines up nicely. The main thing to consider here as well is that because this does have a hit limit before it expires, you would often destroy the bell before the 6-second duration anyway, so you don't really lose anything for doing this, it just makes it actually more effective. Then we have Charged Staff, and this buffs every single attack that we do while it's active by adding a shockwave projectile that fires forwards when you strike. This gives your weapon itself a stacking flight lightning damage boost per stack of Charged Staff, which goes up to your maximum power charges. Currently I have 5 maximum power charges, which means on my current stats with this at full buff, I gain 5 to 75 flat lightning damage on my weapon, which is a really hefty bonus. To try and keep the uptime high, we have the Persistent support gem in here, which increases the duration of the skill, and what this does is just increase the actual length that you gain from each power charge consumed up to a maximum of 42 seconds with 5 maximum stacks of power charge. Ice Bite makes the enemies frozen by the skill give you bonus cold damage for 3 seconds after freezing them, and this is our main reliable way of freezing things in between falling thunder charges, so that interaction happens very frequently, which then makes it easier to freeze things. And then Primal Armament for bonus elemental damage in general, which is just very important as it boosts the cold damage coming from this without hurting the lightning damage that it gains either. After that, we have our Cast on Freeze setup as the first of our auras, and this is actually quite interesting because of the way that it works. We have Profane Ritual inside of it to generate power charges as you freeze and kill enemies, Profusion to give it a chance to generate a bonus charge whenever this activates, and then Impetus to increase the energy gain of the skill by 40%. To break this down as quickly as I can here, Cast on Freeze decides the energy required to cast its spell that is slotted by making it 10 energy per 0.1 second base cast time. This means for Profane Ritual, which has a 1 second cast time, it is 100 energy generated through Cast on Freeze to trigger the ritual. With the new changes to trigger skills from the recent patch, you gain 10 energy per power of enemy that you freeze each time. This means to trigger this skill, you need to freeze 10 normal enemies, or 5 magic enemies, 2 rare enemies, or a boss 1 time. However, because we changed the energy generated through one of our supports, it jumps to only being 6 normal enemies frozen to trigger, 3 magic enemies, and then still 2 rare and still a boss once, just because of how the math shakes out. But the point is that 6 frozen enemies is super easy to achieve. receive, which is why with a bit of management you can keep essentially just rolling Falling Thunder back to back to back without running out of power charges. Other options with more support gems here would either be more ways to mess with your energy generation to make the procs more frequent for this, or specifically the support gem that reduces the skill duration to make the ritual itself cast faster and have less downtime between the power charges generating. An important thing worth mentioning here too is you actually generally want to make Profane Ritual itself with the lowest level skill gem that you can, level 7 being the minimum, because while the damage increases with skill levels, none of the charge generation parts of the ritual do. The radius doesn't change, the active ritual limit doesn't change, the duration doesn't change. And while the damage does go up, which is okay, but so does the intelligence requirement for the skill, and this is our only real need of a higher intelligence requirement in this setup, so the lower rank you have the skill, the lower intelligence you need to have, and with no real loss outside of the chaos damage that isn't really applying to our enemies more often than not anyways, this is a really effective way to make sure that you need less stats to get the actual setup working. Then we have our other 4 persistent buff aura skills for the build, all of which are far more passive than the rest of what we've talked about so far. Starting off then, Wind Dancer is purely for survivability. It gives you a multiplicative evasion increase per stack you have. You gain 1 stack every 1.4 seconds up to 3 stacks maximum. When you are hit by a melee attack, you lose all your stacks and apply a knockback to nearby enemies. Inside of this we also have the Wind Wave support gem, which triggers a knockback when you are stunned, so if you are actually interrupted in an attack. Mostly these just combine to keep you from getting surrounded and pinned into a corner, or between a load of enemies that just beat you up before you can get away. We also have the Maim support gem to slow enemies that are hit by this effect for the same purpose. We then have the Ghost Dance aura, which just gives you a ton of energy shield whenever you get hit by an attack based on your evasion stat. We get evasion just through the roof as a general part of this build. I have around 13,000 evasion normally. 5% of that would be 650 energy shield, so whenever you get hit, if you have a stack of Ghost Dance, you gain a ton of shield, as long as it doesn't one-shot you, and you get it back very quickly as long as you have the charges. And in here is where we currently have Fast Forward as a support for reduced duration, as this makes the actual energy shield gain from the effect happen faster. Then we have our damage auras as well. Herald of Thunder is just extremely strong. It gives us extra lightning bolts on our attacks after killing shocked enemies, which we do all the time, inside of which I've got Innervate, which gives us a bunch of bonus lightning damage quite frequently, and then Coursing Current for a chance to spread shocks from this skill in an AoE around the target. Then finally, for our actual skills, we have Herald of Ice, which is just really strong right now. It causes large pops of shatter damage when hitting frozen enemies with an attack hit, and the fun part of this is Falling Thunder both counts as applying the freeze and popping it, shattering enemies in the same hit more often than not. So it just causes a really beautiful sort of domino-like effect. As far as how to put it all together and sort of simplify the process a bit, you start an area by hitting enemies with Tempest Flurry to generate your first power charge. You put that charge into Charge Staff as a duration buff, and then start using Charge Staff to freeze and kill to generate more charges. Personally, I like to get Charge Staff up to 5 stacks before starting to use Falling Thunder, but technically you can start using it once you have Charge Staff active to begin with. Just do your best not to let the duration of the buff fall off between activations. Once that is rolling, 1 Falling Thunder is enough to cremate any packs of monsters that you walk into, and any stragglers left are just obliterated by Charge Staff ranged attacks from Tempest Flurry. Again, for pure single target content like deep endgame pinnacle bosses, you would want to swap out Profane Ritual for Siphoning Strike, and you could even just replace Cast on Freeze in general with Siphoning Strike if you want to manually cast it, or if you prefer it being automatic, you can still have it just be Siphoning Strike activated through Cast on Freeze, your choice. Long term, some options I'm also considering are adding things like an Unset Ring, which gives you an extra skill gem slot, which would let me take a different skill for that first initial freeze buildup from a longer, safer range on higher tier maps, and for this I would probably bring back up Stormwave just as a nice safe way to apply startup buffs from range. All that said, let's now move on to the passive tree, starting with our Ascendancy node choices. Our first 2 points go over into Sunder My Enemies over here. This is pretty much just a given at this point. The ability to make critical hits ignore elemental resistances is incredibly strong. The next 2 points here went into the Chill effect here, and then into I Am the Blizzard, which gives you a bunch of bonus damage as cold damage, which is very nice, and also creates Chilled Ground when you freeze an enemy. Chilled Ground makes it easier to freeze more enemies that are standing in the same area, so this feeds into our lovely sort of power charge feedback loop. Then we take Lead Me Through Grace over here, which gives us a ton of bonus spirit as a result of the effect. Currently I'm getting 83 bonus spirit from this node by itself, and while you can get that through 2 modifier rolls on gear, so it is possible to do that, having this in your Ascendancy nodes instead frees up those gear slots to not need those modifiers and lets you take a lot of persistent buff auras anyways because you still have the spirit. That said, super long term, in a world where I had like 100% perfect ideal gear, I'd actually rather have the spirit as a stat on my chest and my amulet to add up to 80 or above so we can still use the same skills, but to have that and also have good stats on the rest of the item is basically a pipe dream, and so this choice, putting this in our ascendancy, gives us a lot more potential for survivability at this stage of endgame because we can get a lot better stats on our gear instead of focusing spirit. That said, from this stage, my final 2 points would then go into I Shall Rage for Unbound Avatar, which is a special form that builds up as you do elemental damage and apply ailments, and when active, it makes you do more elemental damage and apply more ailments. So that's basically what we're all about. So it's just a pure damage bonus to what we're already doing all around. If I ever get the perfect gear that I mentioned earlier so that I could actually swap out some ascendancy points, I would take them out of these spirit boosting nodes and put them over into elemental expression for just a bunch of bonus potential hits and more elemental damage. But that is the lowest priority of the good options, really, to put it simply. Moving on from here, then, we have our whole set of passive tree choices at this point, and at this moment my tree is relatively set. I am level 77, so I have plans for every point up to the final one right now ahead of me, basically, so let's just break it all down. First, we come up here through the evasion nodes and over to Essence of the Mountain. What this does is give us bonus damage as cold damage and increased freeze buildup, which is very important for our setup. We then wrap around through the evasion nodes back to Flow Like Water over here, which gives you increased attack and cast speed, increased dexterity and intelligence. We head up through Crashing Wave for bonus damage if you've recently done a critical hit, and Essence of the Storm, which gives you extra bonus lightning damage and also shock chance. We branch off into Moment of Truth up here, which gives you bonus crit chance and bonus crit damage, but then also if you have done a non-crit recently, it gives you more critical damage there. This is part of why we are aiming for super critical as a support in Tempest Flurry long term, so even if we end up with just insane levels of crit chance later on, that one skill will still at least be able to trigger this bonus damage no matter what. We then head up through some attribute nodes, and generally my advice for these is to only take the intelligence or strength that you absolutely need, otherwise stack the hell out of dexterity as your main priority for what we're aiming for. We then head up and around to Echoing Frost over here, which gives you bonus damage if you have applied chill to an enemy recently, which we do just constantly, so this is always active. And then there's also Echoing Thunder, which is the exact same thing, but for shock, which we also apply constantly. So those together is just 60% increased damage for taking these nodes, as well as a bunch of increased elemental damage around it, so it's very, very valuable. Then we head back towards the sort of main track going out towards the edge, and in here we grab Conservative Casting, which gives us a reduced mana cost for our skills and increased mana generation rate. After that, we go up over here and around to get up and over to the evasion nodes up here on Inner Faith, giving us a bunch of extra evasion and also energy shield, as well as Deep Trance, which gives us bonus attack speed and reduced cost of skills even further, so that mana becomes even less of an issue. Right now, I'm also starting to build into this crit damage cluster here. This will generally be something that you want to do a bit later on, like I'm doing right now at level 77, but in here, your main goals are to get things like True Strike for increased dexterity and crit chance, for the Jugular for increased crit damage and intelligence, and then also the last notable in this cluster, which is Deadly Force, for increased damage if you've dealt a critical hit in the last few seconds, and increased crit chance all on the same node, which is very, very, very good. Then after that, we're going to be heading out towards the end with one more stop here for this Evasion and Energy Shield cluster. First, Shadow Dancing for increased evasion rating if you've been hit recently, and 60% faster start of Energy Shield recharge if you've been stunned recently. Stunned is basically just being interrupted from an attack, which does happen, and if that does happen, you'll be happy to have your energy shields back. Then we have Spectral Ward, which gives you +1 to maximum energy shield per 12 evasion rating on your equipped body armor. This is a very important part of a main synergy that we do for this build. We build a chest piece with a ton of evasion, we mix this through a different notable passive later on, and this then funnels back into the Ascendancy node, which gives us spirit based on evasion rating to help us reach where we get. Then we move out to the edges, and here is where we'll be getting another jewel slot right on the edge here. And generally speaking, you just sort of want to take the best of what you've got, because it depends on what is dropped for you, but lightning bonuses, evasion bonuses, and crit bonuses are generally the best things to aim for. That said, it was recently found that timeless jewels are in Path of Exile 2, but they are super endgame, and if we do have the return of a specific one that was in Path of Exile 1, that would be an auto-include for this build, but we don't know the full list that exists quite yet. However, if Eternal Subjugation, or at least its concept, returns, it is just an auto-include, and this basically is a timeless jewel that allowed you to get a 15% chance to gain power charges when you crit an enemy. So that would basically just fit beautifully into our setup. We crit a lot, we have high attack speed, and power charges are very important. We then head up and down through the lightning damage nodes over here, up to the maximum lightning damage increase. Then we wrap around to both of the critical damage bonuses that are over here, and also to the bonus maximum power charges, which is really solid for us for multiple reasons, of course. We then continue to head down around the edge until we get to the big sort of quarterstaff node cluster, which is just extremely high value, especially on the left side of it, like I've taken here. This includes things like making quarterstaff skills count as consuming an extra power charge, which is really good. Things like increased critical damage with quarterstaffs, increased attack speed with quarterstaffs, and increased ailment buildup with quarterstaffs, all of which just really functions well into what we're doing already. We then head down through another jewel slot, which is quite nice, over to the herald increasing skills. This increases your damage in general, all damage that you do if you have a herald skill active. We have 2, so we get this. You only get it once, but you still get it. And then Coming Calamity, the notable within here, gives you a massive increase to cold damage while you're affected by Herald of Ice, which we are, and a massive increase to lightning damage while affected by Herald of Thunder, which we also are. After that, we wrap down over here to this crit increasing tree for a bunch of crit damage increases, a bit of strength, a bit of extra crit damage increases, and then, very importantly, struck through here, gives you plus 1% base crit chance. Every time you see crit chance increase on gear or in the skill tree or whatever that is, it's basically a multiplier that is attached to your base crit chance. It does not add that crit chance on. The plus 12% crit chance isn't 12% more crit chance. You don't go from like 5% to 17%. It would be 12% increase of 5%. So it's a very smaller amount than you think. And so this base crit chance increase here is very, very valuable. Then we head over here to the bestial skin node, which gives you 100% increased evasion rating from your body armor specifically, funneling both into Spectral Ward, the earlier notable that gives us bonus energy shield, and into our Ascendancy node to give us more spirit and reach our 180 spirit threshold. From here, with our remaining points, we would grab the other node here, Enhanced Reflexes, for more evasion rating and dexterity percent increase, which is actually very good. We would also wrap around down here, it's important to mention, to get not only increased energy shield if you've consumed a power charge recently, but also, again, more maximum power charges and a chance to gain your maximum number of power charges whenever you gain any power charges, which is also very good. Then with your last few points you'd have remaining, if you followed everything else that I've done here, you would head right through here through the large amount of dexterity increased nodes over to Falcon Technique as our sort of end point. This gives you increased attack speed for every 15 dexterity you have. We've been stacking a fair amount of dexterity along the way, and attack speed is very, very good for us. So this is extremely powerful for our setup. And at that point, you will have 1 point remaining, literally just 1 point left. And there are 2 things that I'm sort of back and forth between here. One of them is Endless Circuit. This gives you a chance when you consume a shock from an enemy to reapply it. This is mostly for when you use Siphoning Strike, which is again mostly just for pure single target scenarios when you actually swap that skill in, and it makes it so that when you consume the shock to gain a power charge, you might still have shock on the enemy, so you can either gain another power charge or just keep the enemy shocked for the damage bonus. But because this only applies to single target and it's sort of iffy as to how actually important it is, another option is Acrobatics, which is very, very interesting as a concept. What this does is make it so that you can evade pretty much every type of attack, taking advantage of our very high evasion rating stacking, but it reduces your evasion by 70%. It's worth noting at my specific stats that I currently have, this would put me down from 85% evasion, which I'm at right now, to 59% while this passive is active. It does not have negative effects on the spirit generation from Ascendancy, it doesn't lower the technical evasion on your chest, but essentially you lose a good portion of your specialized defense, as evasion is our only real way of mitigating physical damage in this build, and because the evasion procs less often, you will get hit by more physical attacks, but you then trade it to make your evasion count for things that could otherwise kill you as well. Having tried with and without this skill, I think I prefer playing without it. I would prefer to have that passive point elsewhere, but it is definitely an option that I'd like to offer you, and given it's 1 skill point to refund or not, I think it's worth trying out for yourself and seeing if you like how it feels yourself comparatively. Then finally today, with that done, let's talk about my current gear for this build and any improvements that I would make to these given the option. Starting with our weapon, our first goal is just a massive stick of physical damage. Elemental skills in this game transfer a high portion of your physical damage into their elemental effect, so you don't need to have an elemental weapon to do elemental damage. You can stack physical modifiers extremely high on a weapon, which will then convert extremely well into the elemental attacks. Attack speed is also a very high priority as a modifier, and if you can find that with bonus level of all melee skills on your weapon too, you're pretty much just in offensive heaven. Then for the other side of things, you would ideally get leech percentage of physical damage as either mana or life for some good sources of regen. As far as jewelry, my amulet is used mostly just as a giant stat stick to help me reach my actual stat requirements. Then I've just got whatever resistances that I could fit on top of that. As well, now that we are in proper endgame, we should talk about our amulet anointing, which is what you can use distilled emotions for from the delirium activity to apply a notable passive from the passive tree to your amulet so you can have it active without ever needing to actually path over to it. Right now I've got Tainted Strike, which as you can see is all the way down here. It is active, and it's active way far away from anything I've actually put points into. The actual really ideal anointment to do with your delirium sort of materials would be this one up here, Lightning Quick. This gives you bonus lightning damage as well as increased attack and cast speed with lightning skills, which is really, really potent for us, but the actual requirements to make that as far as the distilled emotions are extremely expensive. Either trading for them costs a ridiculous amount of exalted orbs, or the just very, very rare items to have drop if you're going to go for the natural drops. The actual second best one, basically, that I can do right now for a more reasonable price and a more reasonable sort of expectation of people to be actually reaching as well, is Tainted Strike, and that's what we've got on right now. This gives you increased critical hit with your attacks, which is just obviously good for our setup, but also 30% increased magnitude of non-damaging elements you inflict critical hits. This means it applies to chill, it applies to freeze, and it applies to shock, so it increases the damage bonus that you get when you attack enemies that are shocked, which is also very, very good for us, of course. On our rings, we have just an absolutely massive pile of cold damage as the top priority. We don't have any cold-based skills in the build, so the way that we apply freeze within this setup is through flat cold damage modifiers on our gear. You can get this on your weapon if you are willing to give up a slot there. Personally, I have a good roll on both rings and also on my gloves, so I don't need one on the weapon. This is essentially a requirement to make the build function. However, if you won't be able to freeze enemies, you won't be able to generate power charges, and without power charges, you'll feel like a wet noodle. So I really only recommend switching to this build if you have gotten some gear with flat cold damage increases on it. Aside from that, on rings, you want to heavily focus your resistances. Flat lightning damage is also nice just for general damage increases too, and then more of the leeching damage as life and mana stat is just really good for survivability too. On gloves, we have more cold damage increases, then attack speed is also quite important, and then in an ideal world, I'd have more resistances on my gloves than I do here too, and probably another flat lightning damage as well. On chest pieces where things get a little bit funky, every other armor piece, I would recommend evasion and energy shield mixed base to fit with our class, our stat requirements, our goals, but specifically for the chest piece, the body armor, you want to build full evasion for the benefits from our skill tree and funneling into the ascendancy node as well. So high evasion base, flat evasion rating increase, and percentage increased evasion rating are all pretty much required. Quality on this piece is also extremely important as it does increase your base evasion rating under all those modifiers. 1250 or so being the evasion rating you need to hit with maximum quality to activate every one of our spirit skills here. So yes, that is another gear requirement to use our full setup properly, but that's what makes this a proper endgame build rather than one that you could equip at like level 45. Outside of that, the same general modifier goals apply for your armor in general, increased defenses and resistances. Then for boots, your absolute highest priority always is a good movement speed roll. This can go up to like 30% bonus movement speed, and in a game where no matter how hard you build survivability, there are still things that will one or two shot you or surround you until you die, movement speed is simply the most important defensive stat in the entire game. Past that, resistances, of course, are always great as usual, and then as for rune sockets in any of your equipment, if you are lacking cold damage rolls on your gear, you can put cold damage runes in your weapon to fill that as a sort of stopgap in the meantime, and otherwise just fill your armor with resistances. The main change that I'm personally going to make in the future being my next set of armor upgrades will have chaos resistance in the sockets instead of the general elemental resistances that I currently have in here. That just about does it for today then everyone. My current up-to-date monk build based heavily around Tempest Flurry and Falling Thunder as a sort of upgrade from the Stormwave heavy playstyle that I've been using for the last 30 or so levels. I hope you've enjoyed this, and of course I hope you enjoy playing this build too if you try it out for yourself. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.